Hello everyone and welcome to today's Healthy Dialogue from the Faculty of Health at QUT. I'm Cynthia Cliff and I'm Director Knowledge Transfer and Partnership Development in the Faculty of Health. I'm also convener of our every Wednesday lunchtime Healthy Dialogue series, and it's great to be with you today. QUT acknowledges the lands on which QUT stands and acknowledges the Turrbal and Yagara people as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We pay respects to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. We recognise that these have always been lands of places of teaching, research and learning. And we acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. Today, we have Dr. Naomi Stekelenburg in conversation with a researcher, Dr. Lisa Stafford, talking about the challenges and controversies of inclusion and disability research. The title of their conversation is Nothing About Us Without Us. I'd like to introduce Naomi and Lisa to you. Naomi is the researcher advocate in QUT School of Public Health and Social Work, where she works closely with researchers to produce and disseminate research with impact. She's a scholarly communication specialist with a focus on the use of social media and mainstreaming of complex knowledge to broad audiences. And Lisa is a social scientist, a social community planner, and a human geographer. She has 20 years experience in the field of disability and inclusion practice and policy. The specific focus on the social spatial needs of children and young people and their families is part of what today's conversation will be about. Lisa also identifies as a chronically ill, disabled academic. Before we start, I need to advise you that this presentation may have some triggering aspects, as Lisa will be sharing examples of what inclusive research is not, and she will do so critically. Also, before we start, just a few little hints and notes about how we'll be running the Zoom today. So if you have a question that arises as you're listening to the conversation, please pop a note in the chat function, which you will see labelled chat with a speech bubble at the bottom of your screen. And if you think that your question is quite complicated and you would like to actually be brought in person into the conversation, could you please put a little note that you would like that to happen when you put your question into chat. The other thing that I wanted to let you know is that we are currently building a mailing list for the Healthy Dialogues. And so in the polling function at the bottom of your screen, I hope you're taking notes about all this stuff. There are two questions. One's a very important question. I think people might be already answering it. And the second is, would you like to receive email updates about upcoming Healthy Dialogues? So without spending any more time on formalities, let's get started with the conversation. And Naomi and Lisa, welcome to the Healthy Dialogues.
Thanks, Cynthia. Thanks, Cynthia. Googling representations of people with disability in movies, books, advertisements. What you're likely to find are images of bedraggled, institutionalised, passive, pitied, victimised people. Importantly, stereotypes constructed by society and portrayed by non-disabled actors. In fact, in no other realm are you likely to find a larger group of people represented and spoken for by others. In 2010, filmmaker Sarah Churchill embarked on a project designed to address this. 7 years later, after compiling 600 pieces of archival footage, 30 interviews with leading disability activists over the past 40 years, and a very butt-kicking soundtrack, the documentary Defiant Lives was released. The film shows the energy and robustness of the disability activist community and highlights some of their incredible inroads over the past 4 decades. But there's still a really long way to go for disability activism and the research that often accompanies or works hand in glove with it if a fair and just society for people with disability is to be created. As in any field, debate and discussion abounds as to what are the best ways forward, but despite this, one idea remains clear: nothing about us without us. Or, in the powerful words of one of the interviewees in Defiant Lives, Adolf Retzker, I'm tired of all the well-meaning non-cripples determining what I can and cannot do for my life and my future. Get out of our way. Thanks for joining us today, Lisa. Can we begin perhaps with this notion of getting out of the way of people with disability? What does this look like in terms of research?
Yeah, no, thanks, Naomi. And I think it's a really great start. And before I go into this, if anyone hasn't seen Defiant Lives, please, check it out. It's on iView, ABC iView, and it's also available through QUT's own resources as well. So it's really important if you're even working in this space to actually understand the important history. And I suppose, and that's what, Adolf was really going on about. For too long, people with disabilities have been their voices have been oppressed. They haven't been given the opportunities to speak, and often we still see this today in research. And that's one of the things I want to start with, is what inclusive research is not. And one of the things is people with disabilities are not objects of studies. Unfortunately today, I still see this time and time again, well-meaning, as Adolf puts, but we're not your objects of studies. We are people with really important insights and mindsets. And disability research is not a one-way process. And we've seen this the other time and time again, is that it's a one-way driven by the researcher for often their own sort of agenda. Now, good inclusive research is about people with disabilities working collaboratively alongside to determine and lead, what is essential, what is important to be studying. So that's essential. So it's not a one-way process that's benefiting the researcher. It's never a paternalistic approach. And by that we mean this assumption of feeling pity and burden or fixing and curing people. Obviously, it's really important about improving people's quality of life and full participation, but it's the way in which that's approached. What is the intent and motivation behind that? Should be about empowering emancipatory processes, not feeling sorry for someone and thinking that you're actually going to help. That helping notion, we could have a whole conversation just about the notion of helping, but let's focus today. The other important thing, what it's not, is the oppressive voices that continually I see time and time again. And this is particularly for people with intellectual or cognitive impairments, where, the assumption is that someone will do this for them, like we call it by proxy research. The assumption that a survey about someone's quality of life for a person with an intellectual disability, but that's the only way someone could complete and participate in research. There's a whole things that we can unpack about that. And I would like to draw an example. I was in a role of a part-time research manager for an Australian-wide ageing and disability non-for-profit organisation. And often we were approached to actually help promote research or studies about people with disabilities and improving quality of life and participation. And time and time again, we often saw these surveys come across that often hadn't engaged a person with a disability from the get-go, particularly a person with an intellectual disability that this was about. And even when you looked at the survey questions, it actually had who's completing this, someone other than the person. That is so not acceptable as we move forward. I think it's a really good example of what it's not going forward.
You mentioned that you often get asked to be a participant in what are some of the red flags that you might look for if you were kind of looking to avoid the kind of research that objectifies people with disability? Are there a couple that you would automatically go, no, I do not want to be a part of this?
Look, being a researcher, you're always wanting to support anything that's going to improve and actualize the rights of people with disabilities. But it's really funny with chronic illness, and my disability is multi-system, so it affects multiple systems. And it's really interesting when you see surveys. It's always surveys. So many surveys come across and are always asked. So I'll unpack that a little bit more, how we can make surveys inclusive. But you know, often the case, they're always closed questions, and the assumption that somehow my experience is static. Now, if you actually understand chronic illness and a lot of things with multi-system disease, there's so much fluctuation. So straight away, a red flag for me is those fixed questions. And it's supposed to be about my experience of, say, pain, for instance. But it's a closed question to say, oh, what do you experience on a day? Well, it could be by the hour. It could be by the moment. Like, so to me, a flag is, have you actually engaged someone right at the beginning to actually help you shape up those questions? I mean, it's important to be allies and do collaborative research. And that's a really key flag to me, is I see those questions and I think, you haven't actually really engaged a person or a group of people that could actually help you get better, ask the right questions, because that's one of the things, right, is asking the right questions. Really important. Absolutely, in any research.
So let's move on to kind of what inclusive research does look like. And I know that that's actually one of the factors in inclusive research. It's including people with disability in the kind of research process. So can you speak perhaps to that in the first instance and give us some, I know that you've got a really good example of how you do this in your own research. A heads up, so perhaps share your example with everyone.
Yeah, I suppose one of the first things is checking in on the values. What's the agenda? What's the intent and motivation that you're doing as a researcher? If it's about trying to do inclusive disability research or any research about disability, one of the first things is obviously that people with disabilities actually have to be a part of that. And that's why Nothing About Us Without Us has been the catch cry from the disability rights movement since the 60s. So it's really essential. And when we and that's has to be associated with then dignity and respect. It's not just about engaging someone because you're ticking a box. It's about truly, actually, authentically opening up and being listened and being led by people with disabilities, shaping that. And I think that can be quite daunting as researchers. Yeah, great autonomy, definitely. There's a whole range of it. Respect, actualization of full participation, choice and control. These are really fundamental principles. And so I encourage anyone who's interested in this space to read the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities. That's the first, those principles are key and fundamental. And they reflect also some of the aspects of ethics. When you think about research ethics, these fundamentals about dignity and respect and choice and control. So that's one of the first things. The other thing is when we include. Too late down the track, it has to be right at the beginning. It's important. How that level of involvement will obviously then shift and change according to the degree of your research. If you've got a $10,000 pilot grant as opposed to, a 3-4 year ARC grant, there's variability in that level and intensity. But in all scales, that people with disability should be front and center and be helping shape those research questions, and importantly, the methodologies in which you're using. Yeah. So
can you tell us a bit about your example from your research?
Yeah, so inclusive research started because particularly around people with intellectual disabilities were so silenced, excluded and marginalised, and continue to be in terms of how people perceive their capacity and involvement. And so this was one of the methods, but it's much more broader than that, because intellectual disability alone is really complex, diverse. And for a lot of the young people and children I work with, they usually have multi-complex disabilities. So they may have cognitive or developmental delay, but they also have complex communication needs. So they use all different methods of communication other than the privileged spoken word, which often happens. So we use I always will use multiple methods. But before I even get into that, one of the first important things is, if we are interested in making sure we include people with disabilities, that we actually respect that role and that we pay for that role. There's a lot of discussion previously where a lot of people have been felt used and excluded. and they haven't been valued. You know, people will take what they want, but actually don't even recognize them in terms of publications or even pay for their, you know, support. One of the works, one of the roles I've got at the moment in our Planning Inclusive Communities research, which is part of my AIC DECRA, is I have a paid expert by experience role advisor on our project as a central position, and she has multi-complex needs. And so she's really has been great, Pippa. And I'd actually like to share, we're actually writing a paper about how to set up an inclusive research project at the moment. And she's shared from her her own perspective about what it means. So I'd just like to share just a quick paragraph. So from Pippa, it says, "It means that I'm an expert in disability because I have one. I have a lot of knowledge and experience within it. I know it's a lot more difficult for people with disabilities to feel included in things, that it's not easy to have a disability because people don't realize you're a person, not just a disability. They look at the disability first. I know how frustrating it is to not be seen as a person. When I was younger, people wouldn't notice I was a person. I think I know the perspective of the person who's not seen as a person. It's important because you're assuming they're not capable of expressing their thoughts and feelings. I know best about my disability because it's me. I'm offering another perspective, an important perspective. I'm offering ideas to help access the survey." So she obviously has got a lot more stories that we're compiling to write this article, but it really, you know, reinforces that we come from different perspectives, and I come from a different perspective to Pippa, and it's great that we both share and learn from each other. And I think the research will only be more richer because of those experiences.
Absolutely. And one of the things I really enjoy about your research, and the reason it's so powerful, Lisa, is because you often include the voices of participants in your work. And if I could share a personal story, the only time I've ever cried over a research paper, except for it being very bad, is reading one of your pieces and actually being struck to the absolute core by hearing the voices of the participants. So anyone who hasn't read Lisa's research yet, I really recommend that you go to it for that reason. It's very powerful knowledge when it's accompanied by the voices of people who are most directly affected. So, and I think that's a great example of that, Lisa.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we are getting much better at participatory methods to help people have their voice heard. And I think what the expert by experience roles is take it to that next level, is actually helping shape up the research from the get-go. Information, just even like methods are really critical. And, you know, I'll talk about an experience where the children with disabilities really proved to us just how we have so much ingrained bias, even with some of our methods and how they've challenged us. But just before I get into that, people have to be aware of what your project is to begin with. They have to be able to have access to information about the project and feel comfortable and informed about what's being asked of them. And a lot of the times we don't start that conversation. You know, we focus on methods, but we haven't thought about, are we actually opening the conversation up? Are we being inclusive from the start? And it does require much more work. You know, it does. I think it's taken us 8 months in the beginning to set the big project up. We've got time. It's a 3.5 year project, but it's essential having easy read formats available. You know, up to, I think Kathy from Access Easy English is a fantastic speech therapist and is a strong advocate on easy English. You know, she talks about 44% of the Australian population having low levels of literacy. We're not talking impairments and stuff like that. So if we think about like our participant information sheets, how really accessible and inclusive are they? So I always use an easy English format, which means pictorial pictures with easy English, and it just makes it much more accessible to everyone. What we've also done is introduce videos with transcripts and captioning this time round as well, because we're doing much more diverse community work and on the ground. And it just it provides a different story as well. So you have the auditory as well as visual and captioning to help just engage people about what it's about. So I really encourage people, if you are going down the inclusive research track and want to be more inclusive, think about it from the beginning. Think about how you even telling your story about your research. What is it actually about? And that's where having people with disabilities at the beginning, advising, giving you feedback, and changing and shifting those the information is really important. It'll make it, you'll actually get participants then, maybe. So it's really important. Yeah.
Let's move on to this idea of visual methods, because that's another important component of what you do, isn't it, with your research? And maybe in that we can talk a little bit about the Playground project.
Yeah, so this was really interesting. We were lucky we got some pilot funding from the IBI projects to help start up. So one of the things is inclusive play spaces has been something that's been initiated probably from the early 2000s, and we've seen a lot of growth in it. But what we haven't had is the sort of framework or methods to actually ask children whether it's actually meeting their needs. They're being designed for them, but is this actually working for you? We have research on it, but it's always from parents' perspective and not children themselves. Now, the children, as I mentioned, have complex, multi-complex disabilities, and I think 6 out of the 10 had complex communication needs, which means they use communication other than verbal. And also, we actually had one young person who was legally blind as well. And so that in itself had some issues around ethics. But in terms of the method itself, it was really interesting because we actually gave control over to the children. We actually gave them video cameras, GoPros, and got them to take us on the tour about their play space that they use, what it meant to them, what they liked, didn't like, and those sort of things. We had the participant observation, which most of us will use if we're doing space place research. And what was really interesting is through the actual cameras, through the stories that children were telling us, through their videos, through taking us for a walk, it really showed us differences in terms of our other methods. So if we were reliant on participant observation and the GPS trackers, which we used, we would see children had stopped. The GPS would tell us they were here. The children had, had stopped because we could see them stopped. And we could make assumptions that they were just relaxing or being sedentary, right? Because there's all this debate about physical or passive. Yeah, passive is the other word, often the case. But when we were actually watching the films, it was amazing. It really showed just our bias, because we're like, well, they're actually not passive. They're actually actively learning. They're seeking out. They're observing what's going on. One of the young persons was actually avoiding using her stationery, and actually went and sat onto a seat that she knew the support worker couldn't get onto. She was actually using that as a way to avoid the support worker. So the agency that the young people were showing us, we just wouldn't have seen that if we just didn't hand over power and control over to the children to actually show us. And as I said, I've been working in this field for 20 years with children and young people, and every time I research with them, they're always telling me something new and showing me something new. But again, we have to be willing and and open to letting that go. And sometimes I don't think we, as researchers are comfortable doing that. But yeah, it's really critical.
Before we go on to this idea of ceding power, because I think it's a really interesting one. Earlier you were mentioning this notion of like how we normally interpret someone who's stationary, and you were telling the story of how if, as it was the case with the person you were talking about, she was trying to avoid her carers, she would have kind of a few different ways of indicating that, and one of them might be through acting out, but for you to be able to see that avoidance through just going and sitting somewhere else, offered an alternative kind of explanation perhaps for those moments of acting out, or those moments that might be interpreted kind of in ways that show less agency for the person with disability. Is that?
Yeah. Absolutely. And too often children's behaviour is read as being defiant or naughty or something like that. But, you know, we've always had, and when we've been in practice and research, it's always been communications of, you know, behaviour is a form of communication. And so her actions and what she was showing us was clearly the control that she felt and restriction she felt. And playing back, you could see how close, like the person we called it, we're writing a paper about stop hovering me, because it was like that. You could see it. And it was another young man had the same sort of experience, and he did the same. He went and isolated himself and sat and just made his own story and play. But yeah, it can be really misread. And this, again, these are because of these underlying biases and assumptions, what we call ableism and ageism intersecting here, that often, you know, position children as, you know, lacking power and control. But yeah, no, they're very strong agency when you give them that.
You gave a great example of one of the boys in the study who really did have agency. Can you talk a little bit about Mr. Director?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, I've never been so tired, and I was on my walking stick in the playground because I at that time. So yeah, no, it was again, you know, this young man, quite a character. Him and his sister have quite, you know, really rare neurological developmental disabilities, and I think he'd only been 6 months walking at that stage. But again, you know, if his positioning and his power was profound when we actually handed over the camera and got him to take us on tours. Yeah, no, he was happy to point and tell us what to do and move. You know, he was gesturing quite clearly. You get there, you stand here. You know, you can watch it back through the videos that we have. I can put the links in. Just the ways in which that they can control and show that, again, you know, really breaking down and just smashing those, you know, ingrained assumptions that we have about people with disabilities, and particularly children with disabilities. Yeah.
If research is all about adding to knowledge, it sounds like some of your methods are really on point with that. Can you talk a little bit about this idea of researchers ceding control? Because I think it's a fascinating one and really sort of goes against the traditional notions of the researcher as kind of the objective onlooker, making assessments and holding the gaze. Can you talk a little bit to that idea?
Yeah, look, that approach just won't work in inclusive research. Because as I said, I just gave the example of, you know, if we relied purely on that passive observation, you know, participant observation, you could just misread so clearly. And I think it's really interesting. You're right, because this is one of the problems that academics do face. We have such demands placed on us to, you know, perform, to get stuff out, to be the expert in your field and, you know, hold that power and positioning. And that can actually be quite difficult, because in inclusive research, you've got to let that stuff go. Because like how I always see it is, I'm just almost the conduit or the platform or the basis in which I'm allowing people to actually, you know, communicate or show or contest a lot of the barriers to full participation that is so prevalent in our society. So it does take a lot of, it is challenging, but I think one of the other challenges that we really face is ethics. No, which is quite interesting. Now, I sort of tick most of the boxes in terms of the vulnerable characters. I put vulnerable because, you know, they're not. But anyway, we've categorized them in that way. Maybe vulnerable to bad researchers. But anyway, you know, this is one of the issues in ethics, while at the same time have these amazing principles about dignity and respect. Unfortunately, we're in such a risk-averse culture that protectionism almost silences and oppresses the voices. And I'm always having to fight for, I suppose, these methodologies. And I know other colleagues in working in other spaces, whether it's refugees and in First Nations areas of research, you know, they are same sort of things. And if you have more anthropological or geographical research, we are led by people, but we have to almost predetermine the methods in order to get approval. And this is always this tension. and one that I've even faced in trying to do inclusive research, because puristically, you know, I should be having all the methods, all this generated in time. But then at the same time, you have ethics committees that take 6 months, 4 to 6 months. And then you have ARC funding bodies that won't allow you to start until you actually get your ethics approval. So these are some really significant tensions that we need to work through. And so, you know, some of the tensions I've resolved through this is going back and doing variations after the fact. You know, once we've actually, we've just been doing that now, like from doing all the final reviews, testings, all that sort of stuff, you know, your methods have shifted, and then just advising that. But that's one way of getting around the barriers that you have. The other, as I said, is if you've got the expert by experience advisors on board early on, then that can also help you, and that's certainly helped out with us in terms of setting up the information. Also, because I've had a history of doing this, I've already got a lot of that work. But one of the things I do find that I still have to really advocate and argue for is this whole notion of capacity and consent that gets really mixed up, and which really silences and oppresses people, particularly intellectual disabilities, cognitive impairment, and people with severe complex mental health needs. That category, it can get really messy because we get confused with this consent notion. And so capacity is very different to consent. Capacity is something that's dealt with through courts. You know, it's around guardianship. Our role is not to actually is to determine capacity. That's not our role. Our role is around consent. Are we providing people with information to make informed consent decisions? We should always adopt a supported decision-making framework no matter what, never a supplementary decision-making. By that I mean having other people making decisions for that person. We should always have the person as central, having inclusive information access, whether that's videos, whether it's easy English, whether that's making sure familiar people that people know can be with them to guide them through and have access to that information so that they know what's being asked of them, what's going to be used with their information, and importantly then, are they willing to do that? And another really important mechanisms that you can adopt, and I always adopt, is that you have evolving consent. So it's never accept consent and then never asked again. Always with any time I'm intervening, whether it's children or wherever, is that it's an evolving consent. Every time you're engaging with a person, you're ensuring that people are still feeling okay and willing to do that. You never just assume that you've got that one consent form ticked and then you go. And those sort of mechanisms help to actually make sure that, you know, you're ticking that box when you're thinking about, not ticking the box, that's really bad, I don't encourage that. When you're actually responding to those concerns of protectionism that do always come up from ethics committees around that consent capacity question. So again, if you're not aware of supported decision making, have a look at the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and even the Queensland and New South Wales have excellent information from the state guardianship tribunals and information and stuff around supported decision making.
Some great tips there, Lisa, for working within the existing system. If you had a kind of wish list for how the actual ethics process could be changed and adapted to account for sort of more participatory methods, what would, like, number one on that wish list be?
I think, yeah, it's really interesting because it's so complex, isn't it? For me, it's almost like presenting your research. Being able to have an interactive conversation with the panel, I think, could actually help resolve some of these complexities. Because they're really, they experience huge pressure and risk and volumes of information they have to consume. So being able to almost present the idea, the research, the merits, the process, you know, what you're trying to do, and then almost, and then once you do for wider consent and not wider consent, but broader engagement and the development of the ideas or the emergent research, then be able to go back and go, well, this is what's emerged, this is what, you know, the tool is. Having it more, I think, evolving like what we do with the consent almost. But yeah, I don't know, it's really difficult. But yeah, I think that would help, being able to present research and being then able to respond to those queries and questions, because sometimes it may be just a misunderstanding that can be resolved really quickly. I find sometimes it's the length and the process that, you know, we have to then respond, and then there's a toing and froing of response when it can be resolved from just a conversation maybe. Yeah.
Well, ethics panels, if you're listening, take heed. We might move on now to some questions. Looks like we've got some great questions here from people in the audience. So we might begin here with Aaron, who says that his research is on HIV and disability. How can he capture the voices of people with disabilities? I think we've been through a few of those today, and I think you might have asked that quite earlier on. But if you had like the top 3 things that he could do, what would they be in sort of order of importance?
Always have flexible options of how people can actually tell their story or tell their experiences. I think that's really critical if you're thinking about, particularly for people who are the most vulnerable and marginalised voices that haven't often been involved. It's giving them the choice of how they want to actually engage or respond. So I usually always have at least 2-3 methods. So at the moment, we've got a questionnaire that's about all community, because it's about shifting community attitudes. It's not just about people with disabilities, because it's actually attitudes of others that we need to shift, not people with disabilities. So, but in that survey, I've still used pictures. I've still used picture communication symbols to actually advance and help. But we've also then got a storyboard option where people can tell their story in a more informal setting through different mediums, and also having the option to then participate in an interview, or that people could just participate in an interview. So it gives people the options and choice to feel comfortable in what works best for them. Because that's the other thing, is research is only a tiny thing in a lot of other things are happening in people's lives. So we want to make it easy and accessible. Yeah. Excellent. Thanks, Erin.
I think you've got an example of, are we able to show that slide you've got of the more accessible video?
Yes, let me see if I can do it. Oh, hang on.
Give an example of what that might look like.
Okay, so this is, I don't know, can people see the screen at the moment? Is that the web page? So this is, we've been using websites because we've got multiple local governments I'm working with. It's a platform that people can come to. So we always have the options of different mediums, forums, but in terms of getting involved, we're just about to launch. But we always present, this is sort of example of the video to actually tell people about how to get involved. It's got captioning and transcripts. And then we've also give options about different choices that people can make. Some icons to make it quite simple and clear who's involved, and then people can go into those sites and become more informed. So the storyboard, for example, that's for people from 9 years and up. It just goes into describing what it's about. It's got the video as an option instead of just the text to provide the context. Who's it for? And then before you start, so it takes people through. So as I said, we've always got multiple options. And this is because screen readers, you know, addressing multiple different diversities, you know, we have to make sure we've got multiple versions. Don't just rely on PDFs. PDFs aren't always screen reader accessible. So Word or RTF formats are important. If you're not sure, there's some great accessibility tips I can give about web design capacity. Sorry, as you're using, and then it's just stepping people through about what to expect, follow-ups. Telling people really upfront. I think this is an important tip, and for anyone using questionnaires or surveys, tell people how many questions are to expect upfront. It's a really good tip to help engage, but also so people know how much time. 15 minutes isn't always understandable in terms of what does that mean in terms of time and space. 15 minutes, if you're got multiple things going on, could actually be an hour or 2 hours and not coming back. So yeah, there's other ways to actually just keep people informed. And then this is about just giving people, this is the different ways in which people can complete that one way of storyboarding. It looks excessive, but it really isn't when you think about, you know, is this going to, if one person finds this accessible and can complete it and fill it out, then that's one person that could have been excluded if we didn't have that. And that actually happened with the advisory group. So we set up local advisory groups because, you know, every community locally has different nuances and stuff like that. And so it's important to have local input as well, not just having a central panel. Now we had the nomination form in easy read format, and one young man completed that. And so if that wasn't available to him, he may not have actually felt that it was accessible to him and could actually participate. So, and that's great because they're now on our advisory group and is a brilliant contributor. So yeah, it just opens up more opportunities, and that is really important. So that's just an example of how you can actually help support and maximize inclusive research. But you know, this has been led by having the experience advisors, and also a really great research assistant, Rosie, who's fantastic at creating videos and knows accessibility, IT, and also having our local advisory groups, because they've been able to go, oh, you know, when you've just got live, some people work in this area, but they may not, they might live in the next suburb. So can we put work and live? So all these little subtleties are really important to get right at the beginning, because going back is too difficult once you've launched. So yeah. So does that...
It sounds like what you're saying, Lisa, is that this is a fully integrated process. It happens from the outset of the research, and it's not a kind of tag on at the end because, you know, you're making sort of token gestures.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, we would refer to that as token research. On the scale of participatory, it's non-participatory. Yeah.
Just a question from Louise here. She's asked, she said it's always fantastic to hear about your research. I agree. She said, are there any barriers with ethics committees with using the easy participant info sheets?
No, they actually encourage it. I've actually been really well supported through the ethics, and they've really, they've provided really high positive feedback about the work that we're doing in terms of exampling that. No, they're, yeah, it's...
And Shane's asked, with your playground project, were parents and siblings involved in the research as well?
Yeah, so no, not the specific design up in terms of the GoPro stuff, but it was led from previous research that we had done from children. So in terms of those questions and stuff like that. So that was informed from previous work. The methods, it was really testing on the field. So in terms of their participation, it was because we were testing the methods, it was getting that feedback from them, from the interactions. And there was like, we had a smiley face rating sheet that went out the window. That was really clear. That was, kids weren't interested in that. And the other thing that was really important is we had it so scheduled. Oh, let's go do the tour and then you can do your free play session. Yeah, no, it just unfolded as it is. And so that was really clear to us that, again, to replicate it further, yeah, you have to be led by it, you know, and that's why pilots are really important, because you're able to test all these methods and get that feedback and adjust and be led by them before you go into these bigger research projects. So yeah, I'm a big advocate for pilots, but yeah, that was clearly scheduling. No, did not happen.
Jasmine has asked if you've got any tips for engaging with and assessing women with disabilities experiencing intimate violence.
Yeah, this is really topical at the moment, and something it's really profound. And again, the Royal Commission that's currently in place for disability people experiencing abuse, neglect and violence, it's really exposed just how excluded women with disabilities have been from the conversation of domestic and family violence. And I see Heather's up, and we've just put a tendon in for this, haven't we, Heather? But look, there are some really amazing groups, and what I would be doing is liaising with them first and foremost. They've Women with Disabilities Australia, which is the key disability people's organisation for women and girls with disabilities and non-binary. Look, they've been really strong advocate and have been advocating to the UN conventions on this, and particularly other issues such as sterilisation, forced sterilisation and stuff like this. So I would go to their website, Women with Disabilities Australia, and see if you can engage with them. There's also, depending on which state you're involved in, the peak bodies like Queensland Disability Network, for example. There's also WILD in Queensland. So starting to build relationships is really important, and being led by them what's most appropriate. Obviously, safety is going to be critical. And also to remember digital, and this is why we have downloadable, and also that we will post things to people, is that depending on where people's situations are, they're not always going to be able to access digital. You think about postage and stuff like that. So working with those organisations are really important. But, you know, focus groups have been one ways, online, safe spaces, yeah. And I know Heather's work that's done, has done some fantastic work around, you know, photo voice and stuff like that, ways in which people can tell their stories anonymously is really key. But yeah, there's some really great tips on those sites about engagement with people, women with disabilities and violence.
I can see Heather's waiting there, so we might actually throw to you, Heather, because you might have something to add there, and a question.
Oh, thanks very much. I have been really enjoying this, Lisa, and I say that as someone who knows your work. So I learn something new every time, so that's great. You know, what strikes me at the heart of what you're saying, and the concept of nothing about us without us, is that any research that's going to be transformative, it really is an underlying principle. And I think it's driven home a lot more from the disability movement, because people with disabilities have been so maligned and stereotyped and belittled. It really does, it does underline the kinds of processes we need to engage in, and the ways in which we can become scholar advocates, not just this masculine view of the objective, supposedly neutral outsider. And, you know, mate, I suppose the question I might have is, you know, maybe reflect, Lisa, about the differences between a, quote, convenience sample, like college students in America, they're the classics, aren't they, that you just study the people that you're teaching, you've got them as a captive audience, and the kind of lengths that you need to go to, like the kind of, what do you think the labour difference would be in the virtually the same project?
Oh gosh, it's chalk and cheese, really, isn't it? It's just non-comparable, because it comes with mindset, you know, and principles to begin with. Look, I think you're right. It's the labour is much more intense, you know, the setup work and costings. But you know, I hear people go, oh, it's too expensive to do, it's too costly, oh, I haven't put it into my budget. But it comes back to what's your priorities, you know. And I just think that without having this framework, without including people, and from the get-go, the transformation won't happen. We know, you know, one of the biggest criticisms of academics, right, is that our translation of our research, it's, you know, and how much money's been wasted. I think Adrian Barnett did a great study on that, about how lack of translation happens. And for this, for, you know, for whether it's domestic violence, whether it's participation, whether it's about, you know, homelessness, housing, inclusive communities work, like, unless we actually have the, as I said, design from the beginning and build that in from the beginning, have then the right methods and research questions that we're asking and the methods to do that, then how will we be informing change that's going to make a difference? You know, how do we, even from a policy perspective, if we only keep asking the same cohort, then we're only representing a very small portion, and usually the voices that are always heard. And for many of the problem that we face all the time is that it's the people whose voices are oppressed and silenced that aren't heard, and why we have neglected, abuse and violence that we continue to see today. You know, we have a whole Royal Commission on people with disabilities and abuse, neglect and violence. It's, you know, yeah, I think there is no compromise if we're true about having transformative research, and that the voices of people are actually not just heard, but actually listened to, and actually are shaping those changes. It's really critical.
Can I make a response there?
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't agree more with you. I think that those convenient samples research where you do the salami effect and you publish in all sorts of journals in the most efficient so-called ways about the most mundane of topics often, or about groups that people have very little contact with, let alone know much about. That body of research is totally pointless, and in fact is quite harmful because it misrepresents the sort of general population. It would be like asking men all the time about what women's experiences in the home are, because it was easier to reach men, for instance. There's all sorts of analogies, and so we have to spend the money. And frankly, if you can't afford it, then you can't afford to do the research, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. And I think that's where we've seen danger. We've seen this actual danger, and from some of the medical side of things, some of the areas where we've seen policy that has profound implications for people's lives, not just livelihoods and quality of life, but people's lives. You know, we talk about eugenics and institutionalization and stuff like that, but you know, we still see profound effects of that. So yeah, we have to be really careful about the implications we make, because yes, it might be convenient to get that cohort, but what's the implications for people's lives at the end of the day, and livelihoods? Yeah, I think it's really important of us. And yeah, you're right. You know, we're researchers, and we have that responsibility. Sorry, I don't want to end on a downer.
We do have a question from Shane. He was up, but now he's not. Maybe Jamie, because this is I think this is probably, it's probably better if Shane asks this one. Mm-hmm. Jamie, are you able to put Shane Warren?
Hi there, Heather. Sorry, hi there, Lisa and Naomi and everyone. Firstly, Lisa, it's been absolutely a pleasure listening to you talk about your research and just all of the information you've provided about good practices and, you know, having the person and, you know, really central, you know, throughout the research and right from the very beginning. And I guess I just wanted to ask a question. Having worked in government agencies that I think have done a really poor job, not always, but quite often a poor job of including people with disabilities in a whole range of things, including research and consultation and policy development and all of that kind of work. Are you hopeful, or do you see any sort of opportunities with the kind of the environment we're in now with the NDIA and just the way other government agencies are working? Or do you still feel there's so many more challenges there that we have to deal with? And, you know, particularly around, you know, agencies like the NDIA, you know, really emphasising the kind of approaches that you've been talking with us today about disability research.
No, excellent question, Shane. And, you know, and as a fellow government worker, we know we've shared our experiences about this. And I suppose that's where my passion for research came from. Because I worked with children and young people in family support and post-school, like that was one of the initiatives around having better engagement processes, because we just had terrible practice, you know, nothing. We had picture communication ways of engaging and stuff like that. So actually from practice it was important. But look, moving forward, look, absolutely, when you look at the NDIA and the principles, and I think Liz is going to talk next week, so about the opportunities around the ILC grants and stuff like that in terms of the community capacity or building capacity areas. Look, yeah, I think on principle that it's definitely there. It reflects everything we've talked about. However, the implementation we know is still really problematic. And one of the things as researchers that we can really keep helping with is like the position papers and writing submissions and stuff like that, and supporting the big advocacy organisations. So, you know, NDIA came about because it was actually people with disabilities and these big advocacy organisations that advocated for this change in light of the Productivity Commission report. it was them that hold the governments accountable, and they continue to hold governments accountable. So I think that's one thing that we can really support is calling on those principles and making sure that those happen. And hopefully through the ILC opportunities, that research will happen. I have seen indications that you have to show practice, you have to show those principles in practice. So yeah, I haven't received one of those grants, haven't applied for one of those grants, so I can't speak about how that works, but I do know that there are some of those criteria are embedded in those processes. So let's hope. But I think, yeah, we have to keep holding, the pressure has to be there to keep ensuring that this will happen.
That's terrific. Thank you very much, Lisa, for your response there.
No problem, Shane.
Just one final question from Aaron. What tips can you give to develop an inclusive interview schedule in qualitative research?
Yeah, great, Aaron. Fantastic. Well, one of the things is, like, I think essentially was what's your aim of what you're trying to do, and then I think working with individuals directly, whether you've got an advisory group or expert advice, about how do we filter that out? So a lot of the time is having those natural free-forming conversations, and that's how I usually do my interviews, is having those prompts and allowing conversations to then come. But I always pre-test or get information and feedback on my schedule to begin with. And the other thing is knowing that that schedule might go out the window as well. So being clear about, I suppose, what it is, just sort of thing, particularly if it's about experiences, and if you're trying to work out what do people want to have changed, or how to enhance their current experiences. Having prompts, but being open to allowing where that goes, being led by the person, essentially, and not being too structured, because that's one of the problems, is because some of the rich stories that they tell will answer those questions. I think sometimes the problem is if we have this structured interview set, you go, oh no, you've got to come back to this question. We miss that beautiful, that really rich, detailed stories that will actually answer some of those questions anyway. But yeah, having prompts for your schedules are probably a good strategy than key structured interviewing schedules. Does that sort of help? Happy to chat further with you as well.
Thanks, Lisa. We've got no more questions, and we're at our time. So just to end things off today, thanks for sharing your research methods with us. I really love the way that your research as a whole looks at unfolding knowledge and this sort of gently revealing of knowledge, rather than a kind of bullying approach to knowledge. And that for me is something that's really stood out today. And I know that from the chat that people have really enjoyed and taken a lot from the conversation. So thanks very much, Lisa.
No, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for having me. Absolutely. And I'm happy if anyone wants to contact me to have a chat further. So, yeah.
Thank you, Lisa and Naomi. That was very inspiring and energizing. I feel a lot of people will be rushing off to become more flexible and tap into rich stories pretty much right away. It's and it applies to all research. It could be so much better if some of these principles are widely adopted and widely known. Next, as you mentioned, Lisa, our Healthy Dialogue next week, we'll be looking at the Information Linkages and Capacity Building Program from the NDIS. They're about to launch, I think, about $400 million worth of funded research in 4 different categories. And so well worth a look at that as it comes out. Coming along to next week's Healthy Dialogue will be a lot of community organisations who are involved in various ways with the disability sector, and there will be opportunities. A lot of them last year were looking for assistance with evaluation, for instance, of the work that they were doing. So there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration as well, which also enriches the work that you're doing usually when you collaborate. I'm just in conversation with Lisa Steele, who'll be doing the Healthy Dialogue, It may be an hour later next week at 1 o'clock rather than 12 o'clock. So please just make sure that you sign up for the email alerts and keep an eye on the calendar invitations. So thank you very much, both of you. Our time is up and it's been wonderful to have you on Healthy Dialogues. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia.